Marianne Faithfull's work of the 60s has been criminally overlooked and overshadowed simply because she was the girlfriend of a Rolling Stone. But her output was not only daring and edgy, but it also displayed a pureness rarely found in other 60s artists. So we're going to look at her history and play some of her best songs here on Pop Goes the 60s.
Green are your eyes in the morning when you rise. Love return to me. And I wonder when all's said and done, what will the future be? It is the evening of the day. Tell me, Sister Murphy, when I believe in yesterday.
Marianne Faithfull was born in 1946, and she's got a very interesting story. And I'm going to do this in two parts because I want to hit all the highlights because she has a very full life, and I think that her work in the 60s has been really overlooked, especially to American audiences. They're probably not as familiar. European audiences probably know her work a little bit better. She toured there, and more of her material was released there. She did some foreign language stuff as well. So her parents were very interesting. So they met during the war, and her father, Glenn Faithfull, was a British spy. He had the talent of being able to speak any European language without an accent, so he's very valuable to the British. Her mother, Eva, was the daughter of an Austro-Hungarian nobleman, and she had a title of Baroness. And they fell in love with one another, and they moved to England. And one problem was they didn't get along at all. I guess wartime makes for some strange marriages. But one other thing that is notable about Marianne Faithfull's mother on her side is that her great-great-uncle Leopold von Sacher-Masoch was the author of the erotic novel Venus and Furs, and the word masochism comes from his last name. So the father was an academic, and they got divorced when she was 6 years old. So at this point, the divorce separated Marianne from her father, I think somewhat permanently. He remarried, and her mother struggled to raise her. And part of the raising, she got into a Catholic school. It was a charitable school. It was called St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Convent School. So at the age of 17, she went to a party and met a guy by the name of John Dunbar. And John Dunbar was 20 years old, but he was one of the hippest guys around. And this was in 1963, and swing in London was just really getting rolling. So if the name John Dunbar sounds familiar to you, you may have heard it with regard to the Indica Bookstore and Gallery that he opened up with Barry Miles. And this is around the time that was opened up. And the Beatles were a little bit involved in that, Peter Asher, and Marianne started being introduced to some of the very young rock royalty at this time, the aristos as she calls them, which included very famous people like Allen Ginsberg. So she went to a party with Dunbar, and Paul McCartney was there, Jane Asher, and some of the Stones, and Andrew Loog Oldham, who was the Stones manager.
I met Andrew Oldham at a party. He asked me if I'd like to make a record because he thought I had a face that could sell.
And what did you think?
I thought, this is fine. Perhaps I have. Let's sell it.
Is it literally possible to go to a party, pick out someone with no evident talent, and make a star of her?
Yes.
Now, she did go along with it, of course, and she found herself in a recording studio shortly after recording the Rolling Stones song, As Tears Go By. And this particular song was originally supposed to be the B-side of her first single. And it was produced by a guy named Mike Leander. He was a young arranger and producer at the time who later did the string arrangement for the Beatles' She's Leaving Home. So keep that name in mind, Mike Leander. He shows up later in the story. And that became that song, As Tears Go By, became a big hit. And she's all of a sudden is on television shows, she's doing small tours, and she's the talk of the town. And what was interesting is she recorded 2 albums simultaneously and released them both at the same time in early 1965. And one album was more of a pop album, which had As Tears Go By on it. And the other album was more of a British traditional folk album. We're going to listen to a few tracks off of the commercial album called Marianne Faithfull. This is actually the American version. The British version had the name and the masthead over here. I don't have that one presently. The folk album is called Come My Way, with this black and white cover. So let's listen to a few tracks from the commercial one, the one just simply called Marianne Faithfull, and we'll start off with As Tears Go By.
I sit and walk above. I'll send away all my false pride, and I see the morning sun coming over the hill. He sleeps on the wind, this little bird.
So this pop album really sounds very folk rock-like to me. And the songs on here are not overly glossed. They're rather very faithful folk rock songs with very tasteful production. And they're not trying to be overly pop, so it's not real sugary at all. Now the next album, Come My Way, also features additional guitar by her producer John Mark. And John Mark brings something very special to these recordings. He typically plays an acoustic 12-string, sometimes they're double-tracked, and the songs on here vary from more folk rock, typical British folk, and that includes even some spoken word.
Come my way, come my way. Once I had a sweetheart, and now I have none. He's gone and leave me, he's gone and leave me. I was born in Portland town, yes I was, yes I was, yes I was.
Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that snatch. Beware the Jub bird.
To promote these two albums, she toured, and she was often accompanied by her producer John Mark on acoustic 12-string guitar. And this stripped-down arrangement really gave a lot of emphasis to her singing and to the words of the songs, and set her apart from some of the other female singers in Britain at the time and the other European singers like Dusty Springfield, Cilla Black, Lulu, Françoise Hardy. Those performers typically were more polished looking, they were more manufactured. And when I say manufactured, more so in the music sound, where it was very layered and very orchestrated. Not so with Marianne Faithfull's music. She kept it very stripped back, very acoustic, which was unusual for a pop/folk singer at that time. Now on May 6, 1965, she married John Dunbar, and she was pregnant, so that's kind of what you did in those days. And Peter Asher was the best man. And she continued recording through this time period. And her next album was called Go Away From My World, and that was December 1965. The title track was a hit song written by Jackie DeShannon.
All I got for all of my love was a broken heart. Winter's almost gone, oh how I've waited so long for a summer night. Now I long for yesterday.
Another great song on this album is called Summer Nights, which was a little more indicative of some of her singles that she was releasing, where they had a little dark tinge to them, even though they were oftentimes upbeat. But again, the folk rock sound was not overly produced and not too sugary. Another song she had on this album was the famous Beatles song Yesterday, which was not released by the Beatles as a single in England, but by Matt Monro and by Marianne Faithfull. Now Matt Monro, the best charting position he had with Yesterday was number 6, and Marianne charted at number 32 on Melody Maker. So John and Marianne's son Nicholas was born in November of 1965, and shortly after that Marianne left John Dunbar. Now Dunbar, who had been at Cambridge for a while, he was still hanging around with these beatniks that would come from America. Pharmaceutical heroin was still legal in England at this time, and in London you could get a prescription very cheaply. So he was hanging around with a lot of the aristos that were recreational drug users, and some of them became heroin addicts. And this was the type of home that Marianne was living in with him at the time. So it wasn't the best. She was starting to get out more now, and she did like to tour. It was grueling for her, but she didn't like staying at home. She had changed managers at this time, switching to Tony Calder, and she continued to release excellent albums. This is her first American album, just simply called Marianne Faithfull. The next one that was released is this one. This is also an American record called Forever Faithful. Now this one had the great song Tomorrow's Calling on it, which is one of my favorite songs of hers. And I'm going to play two other tracks here. One is called That's Right Baby and Lullaby.
Silver petals of porcelain rose, cobwebs of filigree, and I'm a fool who just couldn't see the Sandman's sleepy souls sleep.
So the song Lullaby you just heard is an original song by guitarist John Mark, her producer. That was the BBC version of the song. So she was doing very different things than other pop stars were at the time. Now at this time she was really immersed in swinging London. Once she left Dunbar, this is when she started hanging out more with the Rolling Stones, and she was somewhat adopted by Brian Jones and his girlfriend Anita Pallenberg. And they introduced them to even more of the swinging London scenes, and more specifically to a drug scene. Now, though John Dunbar was coming from his own drug scene, Marianne was not really involved with that at all. She had been smoking marijuana and things, but when she was introduced to Brian Jones and Anita Pallenberg, things took a step up and the drug use became heavier. Now, swinging London at this time was still coalescing, and the Stones were just starting to turn the corner, because when Marianne Faithfull first met Mick Jagger, if you can believe it, Mick Jagger was not cool. He was considered uncool for a while because the Stones were just really scruffy lads, and these aristos that she was hanging around with still looked down upon them. Now, swinging London, originally the concept was that the class system was kind of obliterated, because whatever talent and art you brought to the fore, that got you into the scene. Whether you were a musician, a writer, a painter, photographer. Now at this time, Marianne started hanging out with Mick Jagger, and it took a little while for them to connect and hook up. But once they did, they were just an inseparable duo. And even though she was a few years younger than him, she was only 19 at this time, she was a huge influence on him artistically, because she brought the Shakespeare, the Lewis Carroll poems, the folk music to him, art. Those are things he had not really been exposed to, and he was really hungry for that, so he just soaked it all up. So the way she put it was that she completely gave all of her intelligence and her grasp of the whole thing to his music, and Mick shared with her his brain. So there's this great camaraderie between them and collaboration. Now at this point she had recorded another album. This is maybe her 60s masterpiece, I guess you'd call it, North Country Made. This was not released in the States, although some songs made it onto another American album, the previous one I showed you. This album was probably her most progressive album of this era in the 60s, because she started going a little bit more in a jazz direction, covering Sonny Goodstreet by Donovan. Still had done some great British folk, but she started bringing in some tinges of psychedelia in as well.
Don't you be afraid, my love, to lie when cocoa shells, turns of Mingus, mellow, fantastic. Then she turned away homeward with one star away.
So as good as this album was, she would only do one more full album here in the 60s after this, because by being with Mick Jagger, she didn't want to compete with him, and she felt that she was his equal. And people often refer to her as Mick Jagger's muse, but I don't really think that's applied properly here, because she was an artist in her own right, and they actually did a lot of collaborating together. So there was another album that came out here called Love in a Mist. And this album is almost as good as this one, I would say. Very similar, very much still progressive folk rock. And we'll play a few of those tracks for you here so you know what I mean.
It's Saturday night, it feels like a Sunday.
Is this what I get for loving you, baby? There was a night when you held me tight and you said you'd always love me.
And feel the thought every day
The other thing she had been doing right around this time is she had always done some foreign language songs, French, Italian, and she continued to do that, and she was starting to get some acting roles as well, because she always had an affinity for the theater. And one of the songs she did during this time was a Sergei Gainsbourg song called Yer u Deman. So these songs you just heard from early 1967, and these would be the last recordings Marianne would make for quite some time as she dedicated herself full-time to Mick Jagger. Another important incident happened in early 1967 involving her, and that is the bust at Redlands. That was the drug bust at Keith Richards' house that involved Mick Jagger and various other people, including Marianne Faithfull. And this bust would alter the course of her life greatly, and we're going to cover that in the next video, part 2 here on Pop Goes the 60s.